Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this legal methodology video on bibliographies and various tables. My name is Dr. Gustav Miller, and I would like to share with you some tricks and tips that I have learned over the years doing research. So by way of introduction, I believe it's important just to set the scene. I would like to do so in the following terms. Please appreciate that the emphasis of this video is to focus on the building blocks for accurate and complete referencing in a bibliography or the various tables that you will have to draft for purposes of writing a book, a thesis, or an official report. To my mind, it is always better to have the full details of each and every source that you are working with and not need it, rather than to be in the inverse position where you do need the full details and you do not have it. I can tell you from experience that that is a painful exercise, often against time and significant pressure to then find the information you need but do not have. And let me tell you, when you're in that position, more often than not, the information you get is inaccurate or incomplete. Now, I do also appreciate that each one of us will have our own system for doing research, not only for finding sources of law, but for copying them or storing them, reading them, making notes, and general preparatory work for the writing process. Now, I do not mean to discourage any practice you have. Remember, whatever works for you is the best way. But may I encourage you to at least consider using EndNote. EndNote is a software program where you can store in digital format the full references, the accurate references for all your sources of law that you could possibly use, including alternate or secondary citations, your notes, and cross-references to other sources of law that may refer to it, thereby creating a very intricate, very complex and interlinked source for you to use during your writing process. Right, that being said, I want to explain again that what I'm about to share with you are perhaps some general guidelines. I know I've used on the slide the word general rules, but it is exactly that. It's a general rule. I readily concede that there will be and that there are deviations or exceptions to what I'm about to tell you. And that is fine. I think it's better to have a solid starting point and then to learn deviations from it than to not have a firm starting point or a firm grounding and then not really knowing what you are doing. I further concede that there may be specific style requirements that a publisher or a university or a donor may impose on you when you are writing a book, a journal article, a thesis, or a report of some sort. So please bear in mind that there may be more specific style requirements for citation when you are writing specific projects. And obviously follow that then and tailor your bibliography and your tables according to those requirements. And then at the end of the day, there's also some room, not much, but I suppose some room for personal taste. And I think that's fine. So before we delve into the details, let me emphasize again, what I'm about to share with you is only a starting point. It's not gospel, it's not the be all and end all, but it's a good starting point, and I hope you adopt these general good starting points. So let's start with the bibliography. The bibliography is likely to be your largest collection of sources that you will compile, and it makes sense to start with that. Now, before we get to the detail, there are, to my mind, at least two different approaches for compiling a bibliography. On the screen, you will see that I've shown you the two options, and I've typified them or characterized them as either an integrated approach or a subdivided approach. In the integrated approach, all you do is whatever source of law you have, whether it be a book, a chapter in a book, an article, or whatever, you simply list it in alphabetical order. Nothing more. The other option is to have a subdivided approach, where in addition to your main heading, bibliography, you also have subheadings for books, chapters in books, articles, and so forth. And then group your sources under those subheadings, so all the books together, all the chapters in books together, and so forth, and then sort them in alphabetical order. I must say that, technically speaking, I suppose there is no real correct approach in this regard. However, I am partial to the former integrated approach. I do not think that there is necessarily a reason to subdivide the sources. However, be that as it may, there are some building blocks for the compilation of an accurate and a full reference in the bibliography. Very important. These building blocks may not all appear when you are writing the main body of your document. So that will be an abbreviated form of this. But as I stated in the beginning, rather have all the information available and not need it than not having the information and needing it. So what are the building blocks? I believe that it's essential for you to include the surname or surnames, the initial or initials of the author, the title of the book, the edition, and then the citation, which includes the place of publication, the publisher, and the year. I've included some examples for you. The first is of a single author book written by Professor Sandra Liebenberg, but I've also given you some examples of multiple or two authors. One being an example of authors and not editors, and the other being of editors, and that assumes that there may be and will likely be more authors to that book. Please note, however, how there are subtle differences in how they are referred to. So this brings me to the style issues. Now, some of you may see that the initials are sometimes placed before the surname or after the surname, and that really depends on the specific style requirements of the document. Sometimes, further, only one initial is used where the person may have two or more initials. So please look out for that. And then consistency is key. When you know it's the same author, then rather use the same initial or initials throughout the document than using one initial, then two initials, then perhaps three initials, or put it before the surname or after the surname. Consistency is key. Another manifestation of this could be where some journals require that you actually write the name or names of the author. either before or after the surname. So please keep an eye on that. For purposes of books, there is a fairly hard and fast rule that the title of the book is always, and I cannot emphasize this enough, always in italics. You don't use quotation marks, either single or double, for purposes of books. There are only two really tricky bits for the title of a book, which is whether and how you use punctuation marks, like an exclamation, a question mark, or a hyphen, or a semicolon for that matter. And again, the point is to use it consistently. And then the second point is whether, to what extent, or if at all, you use capital letters. Now, in the examples I've shown you on the slide, you will see that Professor Liebenberg, I tried to use as little capital letters as possible. Only the S of socioeconomic rights is a capital letter, and then the A for adjudication after, well, as the start of the subtitle, in effect, is a capital letter. However, compare that to the use of capital letters in both the examples of books for two or more authors, where many capital letters are used, in fact. Let's turn to chapters in books. Chapters in books follows the following building blocks: surname and initial, which you should be comfortable with now, then the title of the chapter, and very important, in. Remember, it's a chapter in a book. And then the rest should be familiar with you because we've just discussed it on the previous slide. The only tricky bit here is that right at the end, there is a new building block, which says that you have to include both the start page of the chapter and the end page of the chapter. So on which page does the chapter start, and on which page does the chapter end? Very important. So again, I've given you examples of a single author chapter in a book, and I've given you an example of two authors in a book. So the style issues that you should be aware of here is perhaps that the first thing to look at here is the chapter title. The chapter title is always in quotation marks. That could be in a single quotation or double quotation marks, but never in italics. What I neglected to mention for you in the style issues about books is that first editions of books, for purposes of first editions of books, you never include the edition. If the edition is left out, you can reasonably deduce or trust the fact that it's the first edition. You only include the edition if it's the second edition or later. Something that you may not be familiar with also is that the place of publication can sometimes be more than one place. It is not that uncommon for a book to be published in a city in the United States and simultaneously in a city either in the United Kingdom or in Europe somewhere. So you find that information on the half title of a book. That's why it's always good practice when you are working with books or chapters in books to copy not only the title page, but the half title page. Here, in addition to the place of publication, knowing where that is, you must be as specific as you can. You will see in this example, for the book chapter by Professor Claessens, it is stated as Cape Town being the place of publication. Now, as you may know, Cape Town and New York, or London for that matter, are very large cities. But sometimes actually the place of publication is a suburb. And in those instances, it's better to use the suburb because it's more specific. Also, sometimes the publisher is not only one publisher, it is sometimes two publishers. It is not uncommon for South African books to be published internationally by an international publisher. I know of many instances where a Juta, an Oxford University Press, or a LexisNexis book was simultaneously published internationally by an acclaimed international publisher, something like Asher, Routledge, or someone else. So please be mindful of that. The one focus I want to emphasize here in terms of style issues is the start and the end page. Now you will see that that start and end page is separated with a little line. Now that's a very specific line. It's not just any ordinary line. I'm sure we are all comfortable using a hyphen or a dash when we write, especially when we make words a compound word. For example, something is well written. The dash between those words is exactly that. It's a hyphen, a dash. However, when we work with ranges like page ranges or date ranges, we do not use a hyphen or a dash, but we use an N rule. Now you achieve an N rule by depressing 3 keys on the keyboard of your computer at the same time. That is the Control, Alt, and minus key on your keyboard. And that is included without spaces between the page numbers. So it's one continuous stream of information. That is the correct way, not a hyphen, but an N rule. Let's turn to articles. So the building blocks is the surname, initial or initials, the title of the article, and so you will see this is similar to the chapter in a book. However, this is where it starts to get different and deviates from a chapter in a book. You then include the year, the volume, sometimes even the issue of the journal, the name of the journal, and then the start and end pages. I've given you 2 examples again, one by a single author and one by 2 authors. So let's just focus on some of the style issues. So you should be familiar with the surname and the initials. We've spoken about that twice now. The article of the title, again, quotation marks. It could be single or double quotation marks. And please have a look at your capitalization or use of punctuation marks. Very important to include the year immediately after the article title. And again, focus on the specific style requirements of that journal. It could be that the journal's year of publication is included in round brackets, but it could also be that the journal's year of publication is not included in round brackets at all. I'll speak to that a little bit later on. Then, all journals have, well, let me rephrase, most journals have volume numbers. Be very careful to include that here. I mentioned that some journals are published in 3 or 4, perhaps even up to 6 or 8 issues or 8 parts per year. Now, I've seen so many students include the issue number or the part number after the volume number. And technically speaking, in most instances, that is incorrect. The correct way is to only insert the issue or the part number when the pages, listen carefully, when the pages of each volume, or sorry, each issue does not run consecutively. So take the example. You may have, like the South African Law Journal, which publishes 4 parts a year. Now, each part does not start on page 1 again. So, for example, part 1 may end on page 350, but part 2 starts on page 351. Part 2 may end on page 500, but part 3 starts on page 501. So in that instance, it is completely irrelevant, it's redundant, or even tautologous to include the issue number, because by merely focusing on the page number, you will automatically know which part it is. However, you should include the issue number or the part number after the volume number in a round bracket if each respective issue of that volume or each respective part of that volume again starts on page 1. I'm sure you can understand that if you simply include the citation without the issue or part number and refer to page 7, for example, but each issue or each part starts on page 1, a person could reasonably be confused because which page 7 are you referring to? Because there may be 3, 4, perhaps even 6 or 8 pages 7. So in those instances, it is absolutely important, essential, to include the issue number. The journal name is always included in italics. Now you have to make the decision about whether you are going to include the full name of the journal in italics with correct capitalization, or whether you are going to use abbreviations. Now in South Africa, we are fortunate, and I'm sure that is part of our legal training, to know the abbreviations of the most popular journals for purposes of law. So I'm sure we all know that the SALJ stands for the South African Law Journal, or the SAJHR stands for the South African Journal on Human Rights. However, the 2 examples I've given you here is not that readily ascertainable, because for purposes of the Einstein article, it is first and foremost an American journal, and second of all, it's not a law journal, it's a journal of architects. And then for the Churchill and Kalik journal, again, it's not a South African journal, and in this instance, it is a law journal, but it is from Europe, and it focuses not on general topics, but on international law. So you have to make the decision about the use of abbreviations, or whether you're going to use full titles. In the event that you are going to use abbreviations, it is sound advice to create a separate table of abbreviations. Remember, the focus or the purpose is to help people understand what that abbreviation means, because the assumption must always be that the person who's reading your document may not be familiar with the abbreviation. The last part of theses or of the bibliography is theses or dissertations. The building blocks here is very similar to a book. So it starts with the surname and initials, and then the title of the thesis or the dissertation is also in italics, much like a book. The last part is a little bit different though, in that you start by stating the citation as it is an unpublished either master's document or a doctorate document. The reason why I say document and not thesis or dissertation is, for some peculiar reason, the use of a thesis or the use of dissertation as a designation for the kind of postgraduate degree that you undertook or the candidate undertook is not used uniformly. So, for example, one peculiarity is that at Stellenbosch University, doctoral degrees are referred to and cited as dissertations, but just about every other university in South Africa says that a doctoral degree is a thesis. Some other universities, in fact, most other universities also include master's degrees as theses and reserves the use of a dissertation exclusively for honors or undergraduate research essays. But for purposes of the University of Pretoria, that is also different in that it is perhaps called an assignment or a research essay. The point is, there is so much deviation in this context that the obligation should be on you to, when you read the title page, the very first page of the postgraduate degree of that candidate, use the designation that they included according to that university's specific technical requirements. So if the candidate included it as a thesis, you cite it as a thesis. If the candidate included it as a dissertation, you include it as a dissertation, and so forth. This is then followed by the name of the university where the candidate obtained the degree or which university conferred the degree on the candidate, and then in which year. Not very difficult. Here is an example for you that I extracted from my dissertation. It's not comprehensive, but it should give you an example of how to put the title for the bibliography or the heading for the bibliography. You will see examples of books, single author and multiple author there, of chapters in books, single and multiple author, of an old authority, and I think the only example not included there is of a thesis or a dissertation. But in addition to just citing them fully and accurately, I've also made use of hanging indents, where the second and third, or perhaps even fourth line of a full bibliographic entry is indented. The only purpose for that is to make it easier to read a long bibliography. The hanging indent emphasizes the start of each new entry. Some candidates prefer to just have very large spacing, or to do the inverse, where they indent the first line. Either way, this is one of those areas of personal taste. Whatever works for you and whatever makes it easier for your reader to read the document. Let's turn to the table of cases. As with the bibliography, there are two approaches. But unlike the bibliography, I think there really is a correct approach here. And I think here the correct approach is the subdivided approach, where you have subdivisions for each jurisdiction. Now, I'm departing from the assumption that most of you will write from the South African perspective. So South Africa will be your main jurisdiction. However, because we frequently rely on certain jurisdictions I assume that the United States of America, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Germany, France, etc., might be certain stock standard additional jurisdictions. But in fact, it could be any country with which you do a comparative study, or not necessarily do a comparative study, but use examples of best practice. And for that, I will defer to the colleague that will talk to you about comparative legal methodology. My main point is here, use subheadings for different jurisdictions, but I'll speak about that a little bit later. In addition to different jurisdictions, it's also possible to have subheadings in your table of cases for treaty monitoring bodies of regional human rights instruments. By that, I mean the regional human rights treaty monitoring body for the African human rights system, the Inter-American human rights system, the European human rights systems. Yes, that's plural. There is more than one. Or Asia and Australasia. It is possible to have subheadings for them too. And then finally, it is also possible, if you are working with international law, with treaties, and the monitoring bodies of those treaties, to have certain subheadings for UN treaty monitoring bodies as well. As with everything else, let's start with the building blocks. Typically, you have a party name. Usually that's the applicant or the appellant or the state versus the name of the other party or other parties, typically the respondent or the defendant. And then you have, very importantly, the citation. I've included examples for you from South Africa, from the United Kingdom, and from regional human rights instruments. Now, some style issues that I would like to draw your attention to is this. You have to be careful and make a conscious decision about whether you are going to include multiple party names. There is often more than one applicant, more than one appellant, more than one respondent, or more than one defendant. So make sure that you are accurate about that. Furthermore, you also have to make a conscious decision, a stylistic decision, about whether and how you may be including intervening parties, amicus curiae, or technical names for the parties, if it's nomino officio or ex parte, etc. My advice would be to stick to how it is included in formally published reports, either by JUTA or by LexisNexis. Another style issue here is the citation. Here I want to draw your attention specifically to the South African example I've given you. Now I've seen, and this trend started with the Constitutional Court a while back, and I've seen the Supreme Court of Appeal adopt that now, and almost all of the divisions of the High Court as well, where 3 kinds, and in some instances even 4 kinds of citations are used. Here I've used perhaps the most prominent 3. The first one is a neutral citation by the Constitutional Court, and those neutral citations are readily available on SAFLI, which I'm sure many of you are intimately aware of. The second kind of citation is a JUTA citation from the South African Law Reports, and the last one is a LexisNexis citation from the Butterworth's Constitutional Law Reports. Now, while this is all fair and well to include the name of the case and the citation like this in your table of cases, I would not recommend that you do that in the main body of your text in a footnote. Let me explain why. In a bibliography, the aim of your study or the aim of your report or your thesis is to try and capture the attention of your reader. If you succeed with that and the person would like to obtain access to that case, which they may be unfamiliar with, it is always best to assume that they may not have access to the database or the published version of that judgment which you may have used. So the example could be that you used the LexisNexis report, but they only have access to SAFLI because they are from Vietnam, for example. So they may not have access to the LexisNexis report. In this instance, in this example, having as many citations as possible available aids in the readability and usability of your document for the audience. However, in a footnote, having 3, 4, and heaven forbid, even 5 citations to the same case does not fulfill that function. It clutters your text and it makes it very difficult to read. But perhaps even more importantly, remember, if you're writing a thesis, you will have to print that document. And if you have very long citations, that's going to drastically increase, believe me, the length of your thesis. And with every page that you have to print will have a significant cost implication for you. So perhaps choose one for the main body of your text and then have multiple options in your formal table of cases. Here I've included an example for you where again you can see the heading, table of cases, the Republic of South Africa, the United Kingdom, the European Court for Human Rights, the European Committee of Social Rights, and then other. And this is where I would like to speak to you about another style issue. If you have, and this is a rule of thumb, if you have 3 or fewer sources from a jurisdiction, you don't create a separate heading for it. The reason is then you might have a multiplication of headings, and then stylistically that becomes clunky and not great. So in those instances where you have 3 or fewer cases from a specific jurisdiction, you lump them together under a different heading called Other. And in those circumstances, it may serve you well, and I have not included it here because these cases are fairly obvious, but I think it's best practice to not follow my example here, but to do what I'm about to say. Group those sources, those cases, under the heading of Other, and follow the complete citation, all the building blocks I alerted you to in the previous slide, with another building block, which is, in round brackets, the name of the jurisdiction. Stylistically, that looks beautiful, and it aids in the presentation of your table of cases. Let's go to the table of constitutions and legislation. As the example for the table of cases, I believe here the subdivided approach is better. You will see, however, that for purposes of constitutions and statutes or legislation, no mention is made of regional human rights instruments or international human rights instruments, because those documents are then included in a table of treaties. So the building block here again departing from the South African position, is the title of the Act, the number of the Act, of, very important, and then the year. So the examples from South Africa and from the United Kingdom are there. Stylistically, I would like to point out a common error which far too many students, and regrettably I have to say, some professionals still make. That error is to refer to the final constitution of the Republic of South Africa as Act 108 of 1996. Please, I cannot emphasize this enough. That is wrong. It is inaccurate, and you should be subjected to some ceremonial punishment if you do that. Please see Act 5 of 2005, where Parliament enacted a statute specifically on how to cite the final constitution. The final constitution must be cited as the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, 1996. However, the interim constitution is still cited as the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, Act 200 of 1993. Very different. I've included an example for you with two main splits between constitutions and legislation. You may find yourself in a position where you use constitutions from different jurisdictions, and that will then be included under constitutions. Follow the advice of including the jurisdiction in round brackets if there are more than one. The table of legislation follows the same rhyme and rhythm as for the table of cases, where you split it by a jurisdiction, and if there are fewer than 3 sources of legislation used, you group it under the heading Other with, and here I've used an example just to illustrate it for you, in round brackets, the jurisdiction where it is from. The last bit I would like to focus on is table of treaties and other documents. The building blocks for an accurate and complete citation is the year in which the document was concluded, and then insert a tab. Remember, this is only for the bibliography and the table, so the formal matters. This is not for when you write it in the main body of your document, your thesis, your essay, your report. This is followed by the title of the instrument, its citation, the date it was concluded, not the year, but the date, the full date, and it entered into force, if it has entered into force. I've included 2 examples for you. I think it was apt to include the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, or the Banjul Charter, since we are an African university with an emphasis on an African outlook. But I've also included the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as an example not of a regional human rights instrument, but of a United Nations human rights instrument. For purposes of style issues, I'm going to adopt a slightly different approach than what I've adopted previously. I want to show you a very handy resource available on the internet for free that will help you compile these entries. So you simply navigate in whichever internet browser or search engine you have. You type in United Nations Treaty Series. This should reveal this website for you. This website contains a depository or a repository of all human rights instruments. which, as you can see in this red rectangle, is carefully calibrated, curated according to certain chapters, which are given very specific names. For purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on chapter 4, the human rights chapter. In that chapter, I chose one international human rights instrument called the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment and Punishment. Now, on this screen, you will see within the red rectangle very important information. You will see, first and foremost, the date it entered into force. You will also see the date on which it was concluded. It's called the registration date. You will see the status of this instrument, the signatories and the state parties. I do not want to get into the technical details here. I will happily defer to the colleagues who will teach you international law about the difference between parties that have simply signed the human rights instrument and the parties who have also ratified it. And then, very important, the fourth crucial bit of information is the UNTS, or United Nations Treaty Series number, which you need for an accurate and complete citation. I'm going to depart slightly from my script by including just one detour to information I believe is very important for when you write the main body of your thesis or essay or report, which is when you, in the first instance, refer to a regional human rights instrument or an international human rights instrument such as this one, it is important to, in that footnote, following the complete citation, to include the status of that instrument, not only regionally or internationally, but for your country, where you are writing from or where you are a citizen. So for purposes of South Africa, again, I'm assuming that many of you are South African citizens or are writing from a South African perspective. However, I do not exclude and I readily accept that many of you will be from other countries, may be from other countries, and may need to refer to other countries and the status of these instruments in other countries. The point is, you can find the information on that website just by scrolling further down. So let's just work with South Africa. You will see in the red rectangle that for purposes of the torture covenant, South Africa signed the instrument on the 29th of January 1993, very important date, shortly before we transitioned into democracy, but we only ratified it on the 10th of December 1998, so nearly a full 5 years later. That is important to include in your footnote when you first refer to that source. Now you will see there is a third arrow, a third important point that I've highlighted for you. Some countries have a little letter after the dates. That refers to an entry, a qualification, or a footnote. So I strongly recommend that you scroll down even further, because that little letter will typically indicate whether that specific country signed and ratified the instrument with a reservation or with a note on how they will interpret certain provisions to that international human rights document. And that becomes important because say, for example, you are writing on education, it is important for purposes of South Africa to note that when South Africa ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, it did so with an observation or an interpretive note on how the right to education, formally for international law purposes, will be interpreted by the state of South Africa. So let's turn to general comments. For those of you who do not know, general comments are authoritative interpretations by regional or international treaty monitoring bodies of certain provisions in the respective instruments. So here I've shown you two examples of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and how they have authoritatively interpreted, respectively, the rights of persons with disabilities in general and the rights of children with disabilities more specifically. The building block is quite similar to that of treaties. You start with the year, you insert a tab. Here you insert the name of the treaty monitoring body, the number of the general comment, very important because they run sequentially, and then the topic of the general comment, and then the UN document number. A third kind of document that may appear in your table of treaties, in addition to treaties themselves and general comments, is this sort of catch-all category of declarations, resolutions, recommendations, and principles. Now, as much as there is building blocks here, there are also so many deviations. My best advice here would be to follow the information available in the heading or the top half of that document on the first page on how to cite it, because the United Nations document number or the specific other number will be available on the document itself. And here I've tried my best to give you an example of how an abbreviated table of treaties could look. You will see the subdivisions for the three kinds: treaties, general comments, declarations, resolutions, recommendations, and principles. You will see that on the far left-hand side, you will find or insert the date. A tab is inserted, a standard space, followed by the building blocks. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to the end of my general guidelines. Please remember, this is only a starting point. There may be deviations. In fact, there will be deviations. Your taste will come into play here, but I think these guidelines are a good starting point. If you found this video useful, if you feel empowered and better prepared to write whatever document you are about to write, be that a final year essay, be that a honors dissertation, a master's or a doctoral thesis, or your very first book, I hope that this was useful for you. And in the event that that is the case, I would hope that you would share this with your friends and encourage them to watch that. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.